I've always thought of cartoons as an art form because I just feel if cartoons are not just a joke, they can be an artistic worldview. Like some of the best cartoonists in the New Yorker, they're not just creating jokes, they're creating their view of the world. And that's what fine artists do. They give you their impression of either what's going on internally or what they're seeing and how they're responding to what they're seeing.
That was Liza Donnelly, best known as a cartoonist for The New Yorker, and our guest today on Irish Stew.
This episode of Irish Stew is brought to you by Murph Guide, the New York City nightlife website, connecting the fun to the fun people. Visit murphguide.com. Hi, this is Martin Nutty, and welcome to another episode of Irish Stew, the podcast for the global Irish nation. I'm going to bring in my co-host, John Lee. Welcome, John. Who do we have on today?
Hey, Martin, we're going to take the global Irish conversation in a way in an area we've touched on in the past. We're speaking to a journalist, and that idea of bearing witness is going to come up again. That we had touched on with another journalist previously. However, this is a journalist who works in fine lines of ink and pencil, who uses watercolor tints and increasingly uses the iPad in real-time drawings of events occurring around her as they are happening. Her mission, from some of the things I've looked back on, is to change the world one laugh at a time. She's a cartoonist, a writer, a speaker, a TED talker. She's a feminist and a New Yorker in more ways than one. Welcome, Liza Donnelly.
Oh, thank you. What a nice introduction. I appreciate it. Thank you. Great to be here.
Great to have you on. And Liza and I have met in the past through the Irish Business Organization in New York, in passing, but great to have you join us here on Irish Stew. We can get into your career in so many different ways. You have such a trail on the internet. We had so much work to do to research you. Oh. But I'm going to start off with a question. Why at some point in the year 1979, might someone have seen you on the streets of New York sketching parking meters?
That's a wonderful question. 1979, I'd just gotten to New York. I'd been there a couple of years, and I was submitting cartoons to the New Yorker. I had wanted to be a New Yorker cartoonist since very early. And that year, I forget the exact date. You'd think I would remember, but it was 79. I sold my first cartoon in the New Yorker. Well, to be honest with you, it was the first one I sold. They didn't print, and the first one I sold. They didn't print right away. I sold another one that had to do with parking meters, and I had to draw a dog attached to a parking meter, and it's hard to describe cartoons sometimes. You need to see them. But it had a dog in it, and he was tied to a parking meter. No, when I drew this rough sketch and sent it to the New Yorker, the dog was just attached to a stake in the ground, which, I wasn't really thinking. And the editor, Lee Lorenz, said, shouldn't you attach him to something in the city, like a parking meter? I said, oh, sure, yeah. So I went home and went back to my studio and went out and started drawing parking meters to make sure I got it right. So that's that story.
and how much knocking on the door of the New Yorker did you have to do before you were able to get that first sale?
I think I was submitting as soon as I got to the city, about 1977. And somehow I learned the routine, which was submitting every week. A batch of, we called them batches. We still call them batches of cartoons, of sketches, of ideas, about 8 of them every week for 2 years. And I finally sold one.
When you obviously you've sold many more since then.
Yeah.
Are you ever surprised by the ones that get selected and the ones that don't?
Yeah. I mean, you can't predict it. the cartoons are selected by the editors. They make the decision as to what the senior editor, right, who is now David Remnick, and the cartoon editor decide on what gets bought. And those are two individuals, of course, that have slightly different types of humor, but you never really know what they're going to buy. So you just do all kinds of things to try to make a sale.
I know every once in a while I've seen, I can't remember if it's like a yearly cartoon annual in the New Yorker, they'll print some cartoons that people just found inexplicable.
Yeah.
Have you ever had that honor?
Of course. I just said that the first cartoon that I sold to them, and they ran second after the dog cartoon, was kind of esoteric. And I was thrilled that they bought it. It was a dream come true. But I knew already that people wouldn't understand it, and I wasn't trying to be, what's the word? I wasn't trying to be effusive or not effusive, evasive. But the idea was a little hard to understand. It had to do with art theory, which I don't do that anymore. I try to do cartoons that people can relate to.
And just give you a little background on how I look at our conversations today as a lapsed art historian. So I'm always looking for kind of style and influences and that kind of thing. But before we go further down that road, I'd like to turn it back to my co-host here, Martin, and get a little bit more background on your life and how you got to where you are today.
Okay.
Liza, as I mentioned before we came on air, I'm kind of a genealogical nerd, and I always like origin stories. I kind of come from a place that even though things may happen very early in life, we may not attach a lot of meaning to them, that they really kind of do inform us further down the line. And I know you grew up in Washington, D.C., and from what I understand in reading some of the material, at the age of 7, your mother seems to have introduced you to Thurber, who obviously is a major New Yorker artist, but also, huge influence in the field of American humor. Can you tell us a little bit, was that the point in time where you said, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to become a cartoonist. Is it that early? I think you said it was 7 years of age.
I don't think I was really thinking about career at that point. But why not? That was a long time ago. Kids these days do think about career at age 7, I guess. It was an aha moment, I think, because my mother gave me the book of Thurber's drawings and said, and she gave me some paper and a pencil. I'd already been drawing as a kid, other stuff, but when I was handed these 2 things and 3 things, I started tracing his cartoons because they're very accessible. They're very almost childlike. His drawings, not the humor, but the drawings themselves. And I just started tracing these drawings, and it made my mother laugh. And so that I was hooked from that moment on. I think that she was so tickled by my drawing, and I just continued with my own efforts and developed my own style, which when people tell me it looks like Thurber, I'm so pleased to hear that.
Yeah, that's certainly when I kind of looked at your work and then compared to Thurber, it just pops right out at me.
Oh, thank you.
In terms of childhood, from what I understand, you were raised in a Quaker family. You went to Quaker schools, to Sidwell. You went to college in Earlham out in Indiana, also, a Quaker school. How important is that as part of your background? And how does that kind of influence some of your work?
Wow. I usually don't get asked that question. That's really interesting. And I don't mind it. It's just not something people pick up on. How does it influence my work? Well, I'm not a particularly religious person, and I was for a brief period when I was a teenager. But I don't know if anybody knows about Quakers. They tend to be very socially conscious, and they tend to do a lot of things to help change the world for the better. And so that was instilled in me early on, that not pressured, but that was something that you're supposed to do something to help. And so when I was growing up in Washington in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, there was a lot of turmoil, which actually seems pale by comparison now. But the turmoil was right in my backyard, and I think deeply worried me as a child. When Martin Luther King was killed, it was a real shock to me. And JFK, of course, but I was much younger, and I didn't quite know the significance of that. And then there was Watergate, and then there were civil rights marches and riots. And I just thought, well, I don't want to go. I'm not the kind of person that's going to go on a march with signs. I'm a quiet and I'm a shy person, or was. I was drawing already, and I was observing political cartoons when I was young, and I thought, well, maybe that's what I can do with my abilities, is do something to help other people in some way, become a political cartoonist. So that's how I think that my Quaker upbringing influenced my drawing.
I find it interesting, of course, in the late 60s and early 70s, we have Richard Nixon in office, who is obviously known as a Quaker. One of two, I believe Herbert Hoover was the other one.
Yeah.
Although I don't think Quakers were generally lining up to lay claim to him.
No, they weren't. No, not at all. It was kind of like, yeah. I mean, Nixon loomed large in my growing up, of course, because I was in Washington at the time, and Herb Block, the cartoonist that I was watching, skewered him repeatedly. I don't think I was aware he was a Quaker. Not that would have mattered, but yeah.
And you mentioned this to me before, that quite early on in your life, you lived in Italy, I believe, for a year. Mm-hmm. I think your father went on a sabbatical, from what I understand.
That's right.
And you weren't, from what I've read, too thrilled about the notion of going to live in Italy, because you had planned on trying out for the cheerleading team, which was apparently antithetical to your how you like to present yourself. You were going to bite the bullet and do that, and the plan obviously was scuppered by this living in Italy.
Yeah,
but I also sense that it was transformational for you.
Yeah, no, the cheerleading thing was, I mean, if you know Quaker schools, being a cheerleader in a Quaker school is probably a lot different than a large public high school. I mean, it was sort of just something that we went along with, and it was a social desire of mine to be part of the in crowd, of course. This is when I was 16, 15. But my parents wanted to take a year off and go live in Italy, which back then was not as common for an American family to do. And I was really upset. But when I got there, it was transformational. It was so wonderful. And I felt very independent. You know, we lived outside. We'd rented an apartment outside of Rome, and I would take the bus downtown at age 16 and just walk around Rome by myself, go to the flea markets and whatnot. And I felt quite free and open and an adult. And I think it influenced my drawings too. I didn't draw in the street then, but I did draw Italians. So when you're a cartoonist and you're removed from your own country, like I was, I think it gives you a good perspective on what's going on in your own country, and you also can see other types of people and be educated about the world that way. And I was also influenced by other types of cartooning when I was in Europe. You know, the political, not so much political, but I guess they were political cartoons of European cartoonists that often worked without words, and that was what I really loved to do. So.
Just mentioning the Italian thing, my wife is from Italy, and I've gotten to travel over there a lot. And, you know, the art just sort of drips off the walls, you know, even a small towns, there's layers. My wife's town was founded by the Romans, has a medieval building in the town square, has Renaissance, has Baroque. It's just kind of everywhere you turn.
Yeah,
it's got to seep into your pores.
Definitely. I forget to mention that because we were going to museums all the time. So I was not looking at cartoons, but I was looking at, you know, wonderful fine art, historical art, and it had to influence me. I mean, I was a big admirer, obsessed with Leonardo Da Vinci, particularly his drawings, and he did do caricatures too. So I would study those and like, wow, there's that's fantastic. So.
Speaking of which, there's this nexus, obviously, between art and cartooning. Some folks might art with a big A, as in fine art, as opposed to cartooning. And I know you have an exhibit, or I'm not sure if it's ongoing, at the Norman Rockwell Museum. So where does one leave off and the other start?
Do you have a couple of hours? It's a complicated question, and for some cartoonists, it's not. It's like they'll say, "I'm not an artist. I'm a cartoonist." I don't. I think it's more complicated than that. For me, yes, I do have I did have an exhibit at the Norman Rockwell Museum. It was quite an honor. One person show there, and it's still online, so you can go to the normanrockwellmuseum.org and nrm.org and see some of it still on view online, and some video of me talking about it. But to go back to the question, and I wrote about, actually, back to Norman Rockwell, I wrote about that experience, and also I drew in his studio. They invited me to be in his studio and draw in there, and I wrote about that for the Washington Post. So that's also something that talks about art and socially conscious art, which Rockwell did, and more so later in his life. He sort of went back and forth in that world between art, illustration, cartooning. He was a mixture. And I've always thought of cartoons as an art form, because I just feel like it comes, if cartoons are not about just a joke, they can be an artistic worldview. Like some of the best cartoonists in the New Yorker, they're not just creating jokes, they're creating their view of the world, and that's sort of what fine artists do. They give you their impression of either what's going on internally, or what they're seeing and how they're responding to what they're seeing. So in that way, cartoonists are very much the same. And when I was, I forget what year this was, but when I was a young professional starting out in New York, the Whitney had an exhibit of Saul Steinberg's work. And I was so excited by that, because I thought, okay, we've arrived. He's an example of a cartoonist. He's called a cartoonist, but he's also being exhibited as an artist in a world-class art museum. So, I just think I think that's it in a nutshell for me. I probably could talk more, but that's
there's from my art history days, I'm remembering a lot of artists who, primarily known as painters, who crossed into art that looked a lot more like cartoons, and often with a political, satirical edge to them.
Yes.
I want to go back to another expedition where you left your home territory. I read that in college you were a fine arts major.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had a chance to travel to New York on a fellowship or a semester abroad. Mm-hmm. And you ended up actually at a building that's half a block from me right now, the American Museum of Natural History.
Yeah.
And why and what crazy influences that place must have had.
Yeah. That program was great in college. That was a fine arts program where you could go live in New York and study with a painter or an artist of your that was in the program, be their intern, or an institution that was involved with the program. And the Natural History Museum, the American Museum of Natural History, I should say, was in that program. So I could choose to be an intern there. And my other passion in life has always been wildlife and natural history. And my father was a biologist, so I was sort of influenced by him. And I thought, well, if I'm not going to be a cartoonist, maybe I could be in the sciences somehow, in the arts. And because I wasn't really that great a student, but I was a good artist. And so I interned at the Natural History Museum, which eventually got me my job in New York when I finished college, because they gave me another was it a fellowship or something to work there, and then I got hired full time. So it was a great a great combination of my passion for animals and nature and my love of drawing.
So from what I understand, you moved to New York around 1977, and that sounds like it was a pivotal year in many ways from what I've read. I wonder if you could talk about your memories of that time, because obviously 1979, from what I understand, is your first acceptance of a cartoon at New Yorker. So how did that year unfold and the subsequent years, and how do you keep body and soul together as somebody that is trying to break into the cartooning world, especially at the New Yorker, which is obviously a very demanding place?
That was quite a year. I graduated in May from college and stayed in I went to school in Indiana, which I went there because they had a lot of off-campus programs, and I could go to New York for off-campus. I went to the Soviet Union for off-campus study, and I went to Vermont. But that's why I went to that college for many reasons and other reasons. But I graduated and I stayed in Indiana that summer, and my boyfriend broke up with me. I'd been with him a couple of years. He was not there, but he was elsewhere in Washington, actually. And then my parents got divorced. What else happened? I finally decided to move to New York. A friend of mine said, "Are you coming to New York? I have an apartment. I have an extra room in my apartment for you." So I decided to go to New York, and I got to New York. I moved in, and then my mother died that fall. So it was one of those years you don't want to wish on anybody. But I persevered and continued submitting to the New Yorker, and in 2 years I sold one. So.
And how do you put bread on the table when the New Yorker isn't paying as much attention to you as you liked back then? How did you survive?
Well, I was working at the museum, so I did have a job.
Could I ask you about the museum? Ducking back a little bit, when you were there, were you working with the diorama painters, or in your internship? Or?
Yeah, well, I knew them. They were when I got there. They were some of the masters were still there. They were quite old, but they died while I was there. There were two left, I think, and they both died. But yeah, I didn't do that, and I had no aspirations to be able to paint like that. I didn't know how to do that, but I did do some. I worked in what was called is called the exhibition department. So it's a group of artists. I don't know if it still works the same way. It probably does. We're all artists in some way or another, and we're given different tasks. And some of them can be menial tasks too on a month. Hanging up labels for an incoming exhibit. Or I got to paint a Tibetan balcony. I got to design it and paint it, which is still on view there. I got to create little figurines that were Genghis Khan's ancestors and paint those.
Oh,
and
fantastic.
they're still in the museum. I painted a plaster cast of a large frog called a Bufo marinus. I had to paint it to look like a real thing. So it was actually quite a fun job and interesting and diverse, and the people there were great.
Martin's wants to jump in, but I'm not going to let him for a minute. Okay. Because I just want to follow this museum thread, just to kind of, occasionally I go off the track and get a little personal, but I've probably been in the Museum of Natural History more in that building than any other building in my life.
Oh, really?
Outside of maybe a place I just worked, because my daughter grew up at the Museum of Natural History.
Oh,
that was the default play date, rainy day, even beautiful day. It was always to the Museum of Natural History from the time she was the smallest thing. And she did have an internship there during high school in this science research mentoring program. So I've always intrigued to hear this. Now I have to go down to the museum and find your work still on exhibit.
Yeah. The balconies in the Asian Hall and the
okay.
I I guess so are the Genghis Khan's ancestors too. So
All right. I
anyway.
am going to look that up.
Well, maybe I'll come. Maybe I'll come and we'll go together. And I can.
Oh, that'd be
you.
fantastic.
Yeah, it'd be great.
It's open, so let's do that.
Great. Good idea.
All right.
You're on.
So can I ask about the nature of your cartooning? From what I understand, you describe yourself as an editorial cartoonist, as opposed to, there seem to be all sorts of flavors. I think everything from, the funny comics, etc. My view of you is kind of like single panel cartoonist in the New York Times with just this kind of monochrome, but that's not entirely a fair description, is it?
No, I think it's all these different types of cartooning often cross pollinate each other. As I said, I wanted to be a political cartoonist at an early age, and I at that early age, in my teens, I would look at the political cartoonists that I was aware of, and I thought, well, I don't know if I can do that. I don't have strong enough opinions to be able to do that. Which I now know is not true. It was probably a gendered thinking on my part, but I looked at the New Yorker when I was in my teens, and I saw political cartoons in there. They were a little bit quieter, the political cartoons in the New Yorker. So I looked at the New Yorker. I thought, okay, well, maybe that's where I can set my sights. So that's where that started. And so I was anxious to get a political cartoon sold when I began selling to the New Yorker. And in 1984, I sold my first political cartoon to them, which had to do with Walter Mondale and the election that year. So ever since then, I would sell every now and then. I'd sell a political cartoon to the New Yorker. There's a handful of them, more than a handful over the years. But I also think that political or editorial can cross over into real life as well. I mean, into daily life. An editorial cartoon doesn't have to just be about politics or about leaders or about wars or about global issues. It can be about daily life, particularly because I'm a feminist. Every day for a woman is a political day, and so drawing about daily life can be a political cartoon. And I do more different types of editorial cartoons too, not just for the New Yorker, but I publish on Medium. I do a lot of more color, bigger picture type drawings about politics and global issues and feminist issues. So readers can go there and see those.
I just saw one of your latest posts on Medium where you were featuring Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And it kind of goes to a discussion of the political turmoil that I hope we've recently emerged from. But I think it's no surprise that your politics are liberal. I think that's pretty well understood, that you certainly have not been a fan of President Trump. But the turmoil that we have seen in January, especially with the Capitol Hill stuff, all of a sudden drawing about that stuff becomes a little bit more challenging, a little bit more disturbing. Does it rise to a Charlie Hebdo type consideration or worry?
Great question. Well, I am going through sort of a transition right now, as I think most of editorial cartoonists are. Having Trump leave the White House, you start to adjust to the new reality and what to draw about. Because he was so front and center in so many ways all the time that there was no shortage of material. And that said, I don't really like to constantly ridicule one person. I don't think it gets us anywhere. But he was a presence, and he was a constant presence, and he angered me so much that many of my drawings came from a place of anger, which is not normal for me. And so now I don't know where my cartoons are coming from. I haven't quite figured that out yet. I like to do bigger picture things. I don't. So drawing about drawing about the Capitol siege, I never really rose to a political or editorial cartoon per se. I would draw about it, and readers can see the drawings on that Medium column. But it's just becoming different for me, and I'm sort of doing some soul searching. Like, what am I going to do going forward?
One thing that's different for you over the last few years is that much more, putting it, I know you haven't abandoned the pens and the pencils, but you've added the iPad and that more quick, immediate drawing around events. Tell us about that. How has that opened up new possibilities for you? Is it fun? Is it, does it have its own challenges?
Oh, it's great fun. So about 5 years ago, I was given an iPad and I started drawing on this wonderful, simple program called Paper, and drawing what I was seeing on the television, just doodling, fooling around. And we were watching the State of the Union, which I love to watch because it's just a tradition. And it also can be very boring. So I was drawing the people that I was seeing, just quick. I'm not a caricaturist, but I would do quick impressions of them with this new app, and very quick, bright colored drawings, and put them on Twitter immediately in real time. And it became something that people picked up on. I think Twitter saw me doing this. At the time, there were not as many visuals. There were photographs on Twitter, but it was something new. And I got a lot of followers doing that. So I did it for myself for a year or so, and then started getting hired to do it. And I got myself to the Academy Awards, the red carpet. I found a way to get there, and now I go there every year to live draw the red carpet and what I'm seeing going on. And it's not just the celebrities, not the big names necessarily, but what's going on behind the scenes. The people painting the baseboard that's holding the Oscar statue, or the photographers or whatever, and giving people in real time a feeling of being there with me. And I tweet them out, I put them on Instagram, and then I created a blog post about them afterwards. And I've done that for CBS. In fact, CBS hired me to do this on a regular basis. Back during the 2016 election, I was sent to the DNC for them, and I went to the inauguration for them, and I did some work for CNN and the New Yorker also. So it's a real joy because I love traveling, I love getting out, I love interacting with people and drawing what I'm seeing. Although with your iPad and your sketching, people don't really know what you're doing. If I had a sketch pad and charcoal, they'd they'd want to come over and see what you're doing. But many times you can be anonymous, which I also like to be sort of hide in the background. So I still do that. And when the pandemic's over, I'll hopefully do it more again. I went to the White House for CBS. That was fascinating. I got to be at a press conference. And I've done the women's marches, so it's great. Now, during the pandemic, I couldn't do that, so I started drawing in my studio on paper with a camera over my hand, my iPhone over my hand. And as I drew, I would talk to the audience, just stream of consciousness about what's going on with the pandemic, with the Black Lives Matter protests, and then with the election. And it became, and I still do it every week, 3 times. It's been 5 times a week, but now I'm going to cut back to 3, where it's a dialogue with my audience, and they're talking to me, I'm talking to them, we're sharing what's going on, and sometimes the cartoon will become a real editorial cartoon, but oftentimes it's just drawing what I'm sensing and observing and feeling from the news. So that's been a real joy.
A joy for the audience, to a great break in the action. I've tapped in on several of them, and that's actually where we kind of connected over the getting you on Irish Stew here. So
thank you.
Really, really great stuff. But it is called Irish Stew, so we don't want to go too far down the path without touching base on what about you is Irish, and what jumps out, and what do you know about your Irish background? And
I have a very Irish name, as you know. So but growing up, I didn't think about that at all. It didn't occur to me that I was Irish or had Irish ancestors. I mean, I think it did. Yes, I did know. But it wasn't until I got to New York to to work at the Natural History Museum that one of the older men at the museum, we were all out at lunch, a bunch of us, and he made a point of my Irish name and ancestry. And it was at that point I realized, oh yeah, I really am Irish. It was something about New York that made me Irish, I think. But I didn't do anything about it. I just sort of accepted that wonderful mantle. And I have done research over the years into my family background, and I think some of my family already had this information, so I got it from them. Was that my ancestors came over, immigrated to this country right before 1800, so it was quite a while ago. And I think a man named Peter and his father came over here together. He was young. Peter was young, like a young man, 14 or 15. And they were in the seafaring business, I believe. And they came to New York. And very soon thereafter, his father died. So Peter was alone. But he ended up making his life in New York, and which I love. So we had that New York connection. And he was in some sort of seafaring business in the city. And then just which might be of interest to your listeners, my great great grandfather Donnelly, three or four greats, I forget, was mayor of Trenton. So Mayor Donnelly was mayor of Trenton. And then his son also became mayor, and Mayor Donnelly, Fred Donnelly, was mayor for 20 plus years. And he was the man who helped bring the waterways to Trenton to help make Trenton a real waterfront force in commerce. And he helped build that bridge that says Trenton makes the world takes. So that's part of my Donnelly heritage there. And I'm very proud of that. So, yeah, it's and I think, knowing now what I do about Irish folks is there's so many poets and writers, and I feel, I like to think there's a connection there with me, because I feel as cartooning is a form of poetry, I think, and writing. So, and a passion for politics too, right? Am I right?
Absolutely.
So I've been to Ireland twice now in recent years. I was invited to speak at and live draw a conference in Dublin at the time it was called Inspire Fest, and it's since changed its name to, oh gosh, I can't remember. Just recently changed their name. But what a wonderful conference! I spoke there twice about live drawing, and really felt a great connection to the country and the people. What a wonderful place! I can't wait to go back.
So, from what I recall, or I think we were talking before we came online, that your original immigrant ancestor in your Donnelly line comes from Monaghan.
That's right.
Did you actually make it up there?
I have not yet. The first time I went, was just Dublin, and then the second time I went, I got. I worked out a deal with a tourist agency, and I drew some drawings for them, and they took me around different parts of Southwest Ireland, and I drew sites and people, and got to see some places. But I have not been to my ancestors' county, so I have to do that.
So Monaghan is probably one of the things it's quite famous for is being the home of the poet Patrick Kavanagh.
Oh.
Patrick Kavanagh had a love-hate relationship with Monaghan, probably encapsulated best in one of his poems called Stony Grey Soil of Monaghan, where he kind of refers to the place as stealing his youth. And it was clearly a difficult place to live. And it's probably not a surprise that your ancestor, decided to go in search of better things.
Why was it difficult?
The nature of the land in that part of the world, it's famous for a geographical feature called drumlins, which are actually glacial deposits formed in these kind of hillock-type land. Mm-hmm. Let's say it's the opposite to the Nebraska experience, which is broad, flat, and easy to plow. Mm-hmm. Monaghan would be very much different than that. Mm-hmm. But if you get a chance, I don't know if you're familiar with Kavanagh, but his stuff is actually...
I'm not. All right, I will find it. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I also noticed in your background that you have a Civil War general. I think that was the first ancestor that served as mayor of Trenton, which I think is interesting. We actually had a gentleman on the show before called Damien Shields, who is an expert actually in the Irish in the Civil War. And so I'm looking forward to kind of pointing him back at your ancestor. Obviously, this is a man that, had some serious involvement in the Civil War. And your roots are incredibly deep in America. Like most of the Irish that came over here were 1840 or afterwards. So it's interesting to talk to somebody whose family roots are, stretch back into the 1700s.
Yeah. Yeah. And my Quaker roots from England are also very deep and go far back. That name was Gothrop, which you never hear that name anymore. But yeah, it's fascinating. The Irish were so welcoming, and humor. How could I forget humor? The famous Irish sense of humor. I feel, a connection there. But they, when I got over there, finally, took me a long time to get there. I'm not sure why, but they're so welcoming. And even though most Americans, when they go over there, feel that they have ancestors from Ireland, so yet nonetheless, I felt welcomed.
Yeah, we're still working on that. The old, the traditional Irish greeting, Céad Míle Fáilte, 100,000 welcomes. Apparently, 1,000 isn't sufficient, and so obviously there's an enormous number of Americans that claim Irish ancestry. I think by last count, something around 30 million. Which is pretty fascinating for an island that only has 6 million people on it. So the Irish immigrants, when they came to America, certainly did increase and multiply. But I want to shift back to this kind of, you seem to have an internationalist perspective in your work. I'm thinking of the controversy in the cartooning world of 2005 with the publication in Denmark of a series of cartoons on the Prophet Muhammad. Yeah. And I think much later than that, I think in 2013, you also kind of wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, subsequent to what happened with, the Charlie Hebdo massacre in Paris. And there is this issue, I think, in the cartooning world of obviously freedom of speech, but balancing with cultural sensitivity. And I'm wondering what your take is on those issues. How are those best handled?
Yeah, it's an ongoing conversation among cartoonists. Back in 2005, after the Danish cartoon controversy, which has its own Wikipedia page, if people are not familiar with it, you can just Google it. We first learned how controversial cartoons can be, because I think in part because the internet was just becoming hugely global. And I don't know if I should explain the controversy, but it showed us that cartoons are not always understood across the board by people. There's different interpretations of cartoons, and they also cartoons can be used by forces that are not out for a good reason. So I became part of a group that year called Cartooning for Peace, which is an organization started by the French cartoonist Jean Plantu for Le Monde, and Kofi Annan, who was the Secretary General of the UN at the time. And Kofi Annan loved cartoons. He was a big fan of cartoons, and he understood the power of cartoons. And this was right after the controversy. So he wanted to have a week-long dialogue about something called, they titled it Unlearning Intolerance. And one of the days of that seminar, that weekly week-long seminar, was Cartoonist. And they invited a bunch of cartoonists. I think there were 12 or 13 of us from around the globe to come talk about our craft. And that was really a beginning of an organization called Cartooning for Peace, which is not really drawing peaceful cartoons, as a name might imply. It's more like talking about cartoons and using cartoons to talk, to have a dialogue among people that might think differently, act differently, live differently, worship differently. So, and the organization is still ongoing. We have exhibits. I curated an exhibit for the Cartooning for Peace in New York a couple of years ago, celebrating our 10th anniversary. And there's exhibits all over the world as well. And then to jump forward to 2015, when the Charlie Hebdo murders happened, that also became a big, what's a good word for it? I don't know. Moment to talk about freedom of speech and what's the responsibility of cartoonists to in light of freedom of speech, but also in light of cultural sensitivities and people not understanding or people offending people. So I wrote that op-ed for the New York Times about the issue and how at the time it divided cartoonists in two camps, and I think those camps still exist. In that we all believe in freedom of expression, freedom of speech. That's a given. But there are some cartoonists that feel that's the end of the story. Just that's it. But there's some of us who believe that, okay, we have freedom of speech, but you have to exercise some caution, even though you never really know how your cartoon is going to be received, but you have to give it some thought that just because you have the ability to say something or draw something doesn't mean you should do it. You can figure out other ways to express freedom of speech. You don't have to potentially insult somebody with your cartoon. And that I have to sort of say that I have to say that I don't hold any cartoonists at fault for deaths, but we do have to think about it carefully.
Well, you're illustrating the power mm-hmm. of this form of expression. Somewhere I picked up a quote of yours. Sometimes it just needs to be said in a cartoon. That there's ideas to get across that kind of go beyond words and hit the individual at a different level. Mm-hmm. We'll wrap up with just one kind of look at cartooning in general right now. Liza, is that, are we in the best of times or worst of times? Print is declining. Newspapers, the lifeblood of comic strips, are declining. They're still online, but I really don't know the business model there for comics and cartoons online. Yet there's new things opening up and you're working off your iPad. Is it the best of times or worst of times?
I wouldn't want to be starting as a cartoonist right now, because I feel fortunate that I have a career behind me that sort of informs what I do now. It's an exciting time, but it's also a difficult time. As you said, the model for pay is not good with online journalism. It's much less than print. And so many of us have to keep our names out there using social media and it's almost like we're our own media outlets, trying to keep things going, keep employed. And so I've always had to do a lot of different things. I can't make a living just drawing for the New Yorker. There's nobody that really can do that. So you do a lot of different things: public speaking, teaching, illustration. And I think that's still true. And there's still a need for cartoons. There's people love cartoons. It's just you have to figure out how to piece it together with different outlets, different medium, different usages. I don't know what to tell people when they ask me, what was your advice to young people? I usually say go into animation, because people like things that move. Yeah. People like things that move, and there's always going to be employment for animation, I think.
Well, Liza, we've kept you going here for quite a bit. Terrific conversation, lots of fun, and lots of more things we can look into. And, truthfully, Martin and I, we prep for these calls. We have a bunch of questions.
Yeah, you do.
This may be the record for the fewest questions we actually covered because
really?
we covered so many, we covered stuff in depth. So that means we'll get you back for another episode down the road.
Well, please, I want to hear about Ireland from you both. I want to hear more about Ireland.
Well, just briefly from my end, I'm an Irish American. My grandparents came from Ireland, but I've been back maybe 6 or 7 times, and I've gotten very involved with it through the Irish Business Organization with a lot of Irish initiatives. So I've been back. I've been to Belfast a couple of times. I've gone to a couple of business conferences over there. So in a way, I'm sort of a born again Irishman. Like you, it was in the background for me to a certain extent, and then it really kicked into gear about a dozen years ago in New York. And I think Martin his reaction might be similar. That a lot of people say they didn't really feel they were Irish, Irish people until they leave Ireland. Then they realize they're Irish. Is some truth there, Martin?
Yeah, I'm kind of mindful, and it was interesting hearing you talk about your trip to Italy as a teenager, where you kind of said you gained a greater appreciation for your home country by virtue of being outside looking in. And obviously, the great exemplar of Irish literature, at least a novel in the 20th century, is James Joyce, who lived most of his life outside of Ireland. But constantly writing about Ireland because you need that distance in order to see more clearly.
Yeah, I agree. And to see how people look at you, see how people look at the country where you were born is so instructive.
Yeah. But what we like to do when we wrap up on Irish Stew, and obviously with a big thank you, this has been a fascinating conversation.
Thanks so much.
The list of the questions that we have were so incredibly long by virtue of just such an interesting body of work.
Oh, thank you.
It's fascinating. And but we always like to offer our guests the opportunity to do a shameless plug, which we will also include in our show notes, along with your lovely article in the New Yorker as to how you became a New Yorker cartoonist, which I thought was really interesting. I love that piece.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a real fun piece to write on the 40th anniversary of my first sale. You prepped me for this question, so I'm ready to tell you that 2 things. That please join me on my live draws, everybody. Would love to. People would join. Just hop on Instagram during the week when I do it. It's really enjoyable. There's a lot of Irish people that are on that broadcast that have joined me.
Really fun.
Yeah, I have a little Irish following. I love it. And then secondly, I'm working on an updated version of my book, Funny Ladies, and it's going to be called Very Funny Ladies, and it's going to be published in the fall. And it's a history of the women cartoonists of the magazine of the New Yorker, of which there were a lot over the course of almost 100 years, and there were women drawing cartoons in the first issue in 1925, which I was really happy to discover. So it's a history of the women cartoonists, some bios of them, some little profiles of them, and cartoons. And there's so many more women drawing cartoons for the magazine now than ever before. It's just really very exciting. And I've been interviewing them all this month, and it's going to be in the new edition. So I look forward to that being published, and hope your readers can pick up a copy. So,
and when should we look forward to that?
I don't exactly know the date. I'll find out and get you the information, but it's the fall of 2020.
Oh, great. The fall. Great.
Yeah.
Well, we'll talk about it now, and we'll talk about it again in the fall.
Great.
Liza, thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great fun.
Martin, when we introduced Liza, we talked about bearing witness, and that really came out in the conversation. She's there working, primarily known for her work in the New Yorker, observing the follies and foibles of all of us, and New Yorkers in particular. And then there was that new sense of bearing witness, on the iPad, where she's doing things very immediately, posting them right away, and getting access to events ranging from the Oscars to the State of the Union. And then you took an interesting angle with her in the bearing witness idea in bringing out her Quaker background with its emphasis on bearing witness.
Yeah, well, clearly, if you're going to be a successful cartoonist, you have to be an observer. of all the peculiarities and foibles, if you will, of New Yorkers. But, the one thing that struck me about Liza was her absolute perseverance. She comes to New York in 1977, having, as Queen Elizabeth II might say, an annus terribilis, and sticks it out. And sticks it out for 2 years, submitting cartoons to the New Yorker. And it takes her 2 years to get her first cartoon accepted. And that's not like submitting cartoons once a year. She's doing it weekly. And so she sticks it out in the best and most stubborn of Irish traditions, I think.
Also, as her career went along, she reminds me of something that came out of the interview with Alison McKenna, the actor, producer, voiceover artist, that idea of being a culture maker and of having your hands into a lot of different things to keep, to advance a career on a lot of different fronts. Liza does speaking and she does blogging and she has Instagram, live drawing. So I was impressed with that kind of business plan of being involved with a lot of different things in the culture and art space.
Yeah, and it was interesting when I asked her about kind of difference between cartooning and art. And the more I think about it, the more I realize she is a Renaissance woman. In other words, she's very flexible. She kind of takes to new technologies. Willing to think out of the box all the time. And there's a reason why she's had such a successful career over the last 40 years.
Yeah, it was really a privilege to share the stories with her like that. And to kind of wrap it up, let's remember that she's on Irish Stew because of that Donnelly name. And she brought out some of her connections. And I thought probably the most interesting one was there was something about New York that made her Irish. When she got to New York, it's when she realized what her Irish heritage was really all about. And also she related back to Ireland with its love of poetry, seeing cartooning as a form of poetry. I think after our discussion with her, I'll go along with that. That sounds right to me.
Hey folks, thanks for listening. If you like what we're doing, please leave a review on your podcast platform of choice. And
if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts and aren't sure of how to post a review, we explain it all in our blog at irishstewpodcast.com.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.